Hey guys, welcome back. So today Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana played the tiebreaks to decide who becomes the world chess champion. So this is going to be a short highlight video of all the games played today. So this is the first game of the tiebreaks, and this is the position on the board after 17 moves. Magnus with the white pieces in this game. So here Magnus played the move bishop back to f1, attacking the pawn on c4. So you can see in this position that Caruana has these weak pawns on a6, c6 and c4. So bishop's back to f1, attacking the pawn together with the rook, so it's a double attack. So knight to d6 played from Caruana, defending. And Carlsen goes rook c to d1. So immediately challenging the knight. So black has a decision to make. What does he do? Does he retreat the knight? Or does he play something like knight to f6 in this position? But here knight f6 loses tactically because white goes bishop to b6. If rook to d7, maintaining the defense of the knight, then here knight c5 forks both rooks. So if rook takes, then knight takes d7, followed by taking here on d6. And then here white would be up in exchange. So after rook c to d1, the best defense is probably knight to b7. This looks very ugly, but it holds everything together because it controls this square. So there's no knight c5 from white taking advantage of the pin. It also defends the rook here on d8. So maybe black is going to bring the king over to e7 and he should be okay. But here in this position, knight to b5 was played by Caruana. So Carlsen plays the move knight c5 here. So taking advantage of the pinned knight. Also forking the bishop and the rook. So after rook takes b2 from Caruana, here knight takes e6, f takes e6. So you can see that black's structure is just horrible. And also white has the bishop pair. Black has the two knights, so that should count for something. So here bishop takes c4 from Carlsen, so immediately pressuring e6. We have knight to d4 defending the pawn. Carlsen plays bishop takes, e takes, and then here Magnus started to think for a bit, because if he plays in this position rook takes d4, the very obvious move, after king to f7, Magnus saw that here after rook e to d1, which is a very logical move, just trying to double up on the pin piece. Here black has an amazing resource in the move knight to e5. So the point is that after rook takes d8, here knight takes f3, and in this position black actually has a perpetual. So the knight will guard these squares from the king, and the king cannot go to the h1 square because then the rook comes to h2 to deliver checkmate. So here after the move king f7, white actually has a win in this position. Magnus didn't see the move king to h1. It's quite a difficult move to spot because you put the king back into the corner, which is a bit counterintuitive in the endgame because you want the king to be in the center of the board. But here this just stops any ideas of black going knight to e5. So if knight e5 in this position, then simply rook takes. And then here you have rook to e2, stopping any tricks from black because the rook guards the second rank. But here after this e takes d4, Carlsen probably missed king to h1, so he played bishop takes e6. Then he took on d4, king to e7, and Magnus now decides to go for the rook endgame. So here white is up a pawn, but black's rook is very active, cutting off the white king. So will this be enough for a win? So rook d1 check played by Magnus, king to e6, f4, c5 getting the pawn rolling, and rook to d5 attacking the pawn, also with possibilities of bringing the rook behind the pawn if black plays the move c4. So rook c2 played by Caruana, h4, c4, f5 check, king to f6, Rook c5 getting behind the pawn, but white's king is still cut off. So here h5 played from Caruana, king to f1, and now rook c3. So Caruana is doing great so far, now hitting both pawns on a3 and g3. So Magnus defends that with king to g2, rook takes a3, rook takes c4, and king to e5. And Magnus plays rook to c7, looking at the pawn on g7. So this position is actually a bit tricky, so black should play the move rook to a2 check. So if king to h3, then he can take on e4. So if rook takes g7, then black goes rook to f2, and then he's going to pick up the pawn with the rook. And this should be a drawn position. But instead of playing rook to a2 check, here after rook c7, king takes e4 was played by Caruana, and this is actually a mistake because here rook e7 check. So king takes f5 played, and then rook takes g7. So you see that because the king is on f5, then white can play rook here to g5 check and pick up the pawn. King f6 played, but rook g5 anyway. Carlsen is going to win the pawn. a5, rook takes a4. So the thing is, here white manages to get his rook behind the pawn. So he's actually winning in this position because he can try and use this g pawn as a shield, so that the rook cannot give checks along the back rank. So here rook a1, king f3. So this rook is really ideally placed, just protecting, just watching over the passed pawn and also cutting black's king from entering the position. a3, and we have rook a6 check. So here king to g7 played from Caruana. Maybe not the best move, but this is already very difficult for Caruana. King to g2, rook a2, king h3, rook a1, h5, king h7, and now g4. So you can see that Magnus is leading the way with the h-pawn so that he can continue to hide his king, potentially on g5, and also if somehow white manages to win the a-pawn, then with the pawn on g4, this should be winning. White has two pawns, and the pawn will always shield white's kings from checks on the sides. So here king g7 played, king to h4, a2, but now king g5, so the rook doesn't have any checks. King to f7 was played, h6, so the rook can now check on the sides to continuously push the king backwards. But here Caruana played the move rook to b1, giving out the pawn to try and defend his position. So Magnus plays rook a7 check first, kicking the king back, and then he takes on a2. Rook b5 check was played, but now this is already theoretically a won position for white. So with two pawns, this is just winning. In fact, Caruana resigned in this position. So the theory for white to win this position is that he's going to play g5, then try to bring the rook to e7, and then this king will slide all the way to this d7 square to support rook d8 from the rook to, well, black would most likely play the rook back to the back rank to avoid mate, and then rook to e8 would trade off rooks. So game 1 won by Magnus, so let's take a look at the other games. So in game 2, this is the position on the board after 20 moves. Caruana with the white pieces, and it's his move. So in this position, he could play the very natural castle's kingside. But I suspect he didn't play this because he didn't like the looks of queen to g4, which basically forces an exchange of queens. Because if white goes queen to d3, then just knight takes h4, the pawn is pinned. So after queen takes g4, h takes g4, this takes a lot of the juice out of the position. So here after 20 moves, now it's move 21 for Caruana, he plays the move c5. Magnus castles, so Caruana plays c6, so this is his idea. trying to create a passed pawn, but this is very double-edged because it gives Carlsen great control of the center with these two pawns. So after b takes, d takes c6, rook f to c8 played, putting pressure on the pawn immediately. So Caruana plays queen to c4, just giving protection here. And bishop drops back to d8 to prevent the pawn from advancing further with c7. So here Caruana played knight to d5, a very natural move. Another interesting move was knight to b5, threatening knight takes d6. But here things get pretty sharp after bishop a5 check. So if bishop blocks, then black simply takes, followed by taking on f2. So king f1. But here black has to move d5. So comes with tempo on the queen, also with ideas of pushing the pawn down the board. So if the queen drops back, then queen to e6, stepping out of any knight d6 forks from white, followed by going d4. So here after d5, if white takes the pawn, then here black can go knight to e7. So if the queen retreats to, let's say, g2, then queen d3 check, picks up the knight. And if queen back to d1, then simply rook takes c6. So the most challenging try is knight to d6, attacking the queen and the rook. But here after queen f6, queen d3, rook to d8, pinning the knight, also comes with a double attack. But here bishop g5 with a very sharp game. Queen e6, probably the move, the best try for black. So renewing the threat of rook takes d6. So this is very sharp, probably even slightly better for black this position. So here knight d5 was played. So we have e4 from Magnus, sorry. So with ideas of the knight bouncing into d3 or even f3, also this opens up an attack on the knight. So rook a5 could be quite annoying for Caruana. So this is already quite difficult. And Caruana in this position, he could play bishop to f4 to control the e5 square. Well, but after knight takes, bishop a5 check, king f1, bishop d2, attacking the rook, also the knight on f4, and black is doing pretty well. So it's quite hard to suggest a move for Caruana after e4. But here Caruana played c7, which gives up his only trump card in the position. So here bishop takes c7 from Magnus. Looks like this drops a piece after knight takes c7. But here Magnus has knight to e5. This comes with tempo on the queen and also threatening to land a big check on d3. And also the queen could come into f3. So black's position is already looking very good. So what happens if the queen drops back? For example, queen to c2. Then here knight d3 check, king d2, and then you play rook a to b8. So it seems like white has everything covered, but unfortunately b2 is a bit weak, so rook takes b2 would win the queen, and if b3, then rook to b7, just piling up on the pinned knight, and this should be winning for black. So what if white tries queen to d5? Well, here just rook a to b8 again, stepping out of the knight's attack, also looking at the b2 pawn. So here white is probably hoping for knight d3. Well, instead of rook a to b8, white was hoping for knight d3 check. And then he would play king to d2, and after queen takes, and then, well, after this variation, white would have two minor pieces for the rook. So this is what queen d5 hopes for. But here rook a to b8, and if white castles, then you have to worry about something like rook takes c7, because this removes the defender of the queen, and after rook takes, knight f3 check wins the queen. Let's go back a bit. So here, after the move rook a to b8, stepping out of the knight's attack, so here the knight can't really move, let's say to a6, because then Again, the queen is undefended, and as we discussed earlier, black has to move knight to f3 check, just picking up the queen on d5. So if queen takes d6, then here probably just knight d3 check. Alright, so back to the game. Knight to e5 comes with tempo on the queen, so also threatening this. So here Caruana played knight to d5. So trying to play knight to e7 check. So here Magnus just plays king to h7. So removing any ideas of knight e7, and Caruana actually resigned the game. So the possible continuation would be something like queen to e2. Then here just knight d3, king f1, knight takes c1, and if knight to e7, just queen to e5. And the queen is under attack, so it has to move. Let's say queen d1, then you pick up the knight, bishop takes c1. So black is up an exchange, and also he has very nice central pawns. So this should be easily winning for Carlsen. Alright, so let's take a look at the next game. So this is game 3 of the tie breaks, and this is the position on the board after 24 moves. So Magnus is up 2-0 in the match, and Caruana needs to win this game in order to keep any chance alive. So at the moment, Magnus's knight on c3, Magnus has the white pieces in this game, so his knight is under fire by Fabiano's queen. So he played the move knight to a4, with some ideas of going g5, then he can take on c5, taking advantage of the pinned rook. So here Caruana drops the queen back to c7, giving more protection to the rook. So Magnus just needs a draw in this position, so he could consider bringing the knight back to c3. But here he played the move e5, trying to simplify the position by force. D takes e5 played by Caruana, so here if knight to e8, this simply drops a pawn after e takes, and then knight takes c5. So here d takes e5 played, we have knight takes c5, rook takes d2, queen takes d2, and then here black could play e takes f4, but this just allows white to trade off more pieces after knight takes b7. So here after queen takes d2, Caruana played the bishop back to a8, keeping it on the more active diagonal as opposed to dropping it back to c8. We have f takes e5 here from Magnus. So here if knight takes, then we have knight takes e6 is a very nice tactical shot, attacking the queen, also opening up an attack on the bishop. And after this is taken, then bishop takes a8. Oh, one moment, I forgot to mention that after bishop to a8, so here it's tempting to take on a6, but black has queen b6 check, which would win the knight. So that is why Magnus played f takes e5. So instead of playing knight takes e5, which fails to this knight takes e6 shot, queen takes e5 was played by Caruana. Magnus plays knight d7, attacking the queen, also the knight on f6, preparing to trade down even more. Queen b2 from Caruana. So if knight takes f6, then g takes. This gives the king a flight square on g7, and Magnus probably didn't like this. So after queen b2, he played queen d6. So threatening bishop takes c6, also with ideas of queen f8 check. So if queen takes c2, then Magnus can force a draw with queen to f8 check. Take on f6 and then take on f7. So he can always play queen f8, queen f7 check and draw the game with perpetual, which would help him to secure the title. So here after queen to d6, knight takes d7 played by Caruana. Queen takes c2. But now Magnus plays queen e8 check and he picks up the bishop. So here if black goes queen c1 check, queen f4 and then king to g1, then knight to d4. The problem is that here Carlsen can play queen e4 check and trade off queens, something that Caruana doesn't want. So here here I forgot to mention that if knight d4, then just bishop e4 check, and white wins. So Caruana played queen to d1, so his idea is that after queen to d6, knight d4, white cannot force an exchange of queens with queen to e4, but Carlsen plays queen e4 check anyway. So if black goes king to g8, Carlsen might even consider pushing b4 and c5. So the black queen cannot take on b4 because it has to keep watch of the knight. So king g8 wasn't played, Caruana played f5. That is taken, and then queen to e3, just controlling the dark squares. Very logical defensive move. Knight to e6, Magnus pushes his pawns, b4. So here, black's best move was probably to play knight to f4, trying to trade off the bishop. But this only leads to a draw, so it's understandable that Caruana didn't go for this. He played in this position knight to g5, which is actually an inaccuracy. The knight doesn't do much on the square and it's rather awkward. So now Carlsen pushes his pawn, queen to f6, c6, so the pawn is getting dangerously close to queening. So black's best try here is to play queen to d6, trying to blockade the pawns. That is probably his last chance to salvage the game, but here Caruana finally cracks knight to e6. So here Carlsen pushes a4, preparing to play b5, knight c7, stopping that, but queen to f4, just attacking the knight, knight back to e6, queen to d6, renewing the threat of b5, and black seems to be lost now. He played queen to a1 check, king to h2, and then knight to d4, so you cannot play this because white simply takes the knight, so knight d4, c7, so just threatening the queen. Caruana tried on for a bit, he played queen to c3, but here queen to c5 from Magnus just cuts the queen off and preparing to promote the pawn. Queen to e3 played c8 queen, f4, queen back to g4. So white is up a whole queen and everything is covered in this position. So Caruana resigned the game. So Magnus won the tiebreaks 3-0 very convincingly and defends his title. So that is all for this video, folks. As usual, if you enjoyed the content, feel free to like, share and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching and have a great day.